I want to take a moment to also discuss the policy since we are talking about inflation and the global context and rates. Given that there'll also be increased focus on the RBI in the context of the budget, increased pressure on borrowings, what they might do and whether or not they'll hike rates, perhaps in this particular meet itself. What are you anticipating?
It's always, not right to second guess what the RBI is going to do. But I think that it's clear that if things continue as they are, I think the status quo is not tenable for the RBI. It's just not tenable. I think that you can't have a situation where every central bank is raising interest rates and quite substantially, especially the major banks, especially the United States. There'll just be too much volatility in foreign exchange markets and capital flows for India not to respond. And here I think the danger is really, and I think one should say it very starkly, the danger is that if you're behind the curve on this, then markets get extra volatile, and then it becomes even more difficult to manage. So I think it's really important for the central bank, for the RBI, is to be a little bit ahead of the curve, anticipate, and don't put. Now, I don't want to be alarmist, because remember that the good news is that India has 30 billion dollars in reserves. That gives India a good cushion. But having said that, that doesn't give you a license not to do anything. Reserves gives you some extra room for maneuver and flexibility, but they're not a license to be completely behind the curve.
So that's just it. The finance secretary actually referred to this budget as a neutral one. And you yourself just said that there are a lot of assumptions built in that things will actually kickstart. Again, a question that's been asked very often is that they've allocated or suggested certain budgetary spending, but will they actually follow through, since they've again assumed that the economy will recover, that growth will be intact, and so forth. What do you feel are the chances? Where do you feel we are in the recovery path?
Look, I think the recovery has been so-so. It's not been, we had a very sharp decline in 2020, which was the highest in the world. I mean, the most severely impacted country in the world. I think people shouldn't forget that. And then we've recovered. So the level of GDP is barely come back to pre-pandemic levels. So it's not, if you look at the index of industrial production, etc., we're barely come back. And of course, the composition of that recovery has been quite, skewed. I think it's fair to say that people at the bottom half have suffered more. And, all this talk about the K-shaped recovery, there's some truth to that. So I think, we're not in by any means, bouncing back to a fantastic trajectory of growth. So I think we have to be cautious. Yes, there are some bright spots. I think exports are doing well. I think taxes have done well last year. But overall, the economy is still fairly weak. Labor markets especially are very weak. The SME sector is actually quite weak because, remember, it's been hit by a series of shocks. So I think one should be fairly modest about where the Indian economy stands today in the aftermath. And remember, the last point I would make is something that I've been emphasizing a lot, that the Indian economy was very weak even going into the pandemic. So it's not as if, we had gangbuster, we did very well before, and this is just a kind of temporary aberration, and we're going to bounce back to that. So I think that's why we have to be fairly cautious and fairly watchful and plan accordingly.